Sam Wiles presents Only Fools and Podcasts, an in-depth episode-by-episode guide, analysis and celebration of England's most beloved and successful sitcom. To find out more about the show, contact us at onlyfoolspod@gmail.com. Lovely jubbly. Trigger warning. This episode does contain trigger. Au revoir and welcome to the first episode of Only Fools and Podcasts. Wow, we are here. This is a show I've been meaning to get off the floor for a while now. Friends and family and co-workers alike have been saying, Sam, you've been talking about the show for a while. Where is it? Why is it not out there? Well, okay, folks, here it is. Due to fan demand, there is finally going to be an Only Fools show, which, surprisingly enough, especially to me, hasn't actually been done yet. So this, for me, this is actually very exciting. But who am I? Well, that is that great little self-interview technique where you can just ask yourself questions to answer them. So yeah, who am I? My name is Sam Wiles. I'm 23. I'm from England, and I'm a big fan of podcasts. I love shows like the Joe Rogan podcast, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, Bret Easton Ellis's show. Love That Album, a great Australian show, hosted by my friend Maurice. And I actually also co-host... this is my first podcast. I do co-host another show with my friend Tom Quee called Down in the Hole, where we review the films and albums of Tom Waits. And my dear friend and co-host Tom Quee, he's already on the, by the time of this recording, on the third or fourth episode of his own quote-unquote spin-off podcast, Battle Rap Resume, which I highly recommend you check out. Though I'm not really sure what the Venn diagram of battle rap fans, podcast fans and Only Fools and Horses fans are, but if you are in that weird little intersection, then please check it out because you're in for a treat. This is actually the first podcast that I've hosted myself, entirely by myself, but I am excited to push through that pain barrier because Only Fools and Horses is a show and a subject that I've been meaning to get off my chest for a while. Now, being 23, you probably correctly guessed that unlike the majority of the show's fans out there, I wasn't exactly around for most of the original run of the show. It did end in 2003, and it's very much like whenever you tell anyone over the age of 40 that you like a band from the 60s or the 70s, and they're like, wow, aren't you a little young for that? And I'd really argue no. The timelessness and universal nature of the show means it is just as good today, in my humble opinion, as it was when it came out. I mean, there are so many shows that have fallen by the wayside now, and there are plenty of British sitcoms from this era that, when you do go back and watch them, they really don't make you laugh in the same way. I've been a fan of Only Fools and Horses since, well, before I could ride a bike, really. It is ingrained in my childhood psyche and is totally inseparable from my history. Long before I became one of those guys who ends up filling entire DVD shelves with movies that they'll only watch once, my dad, as it happened, as his own little pet project, had already cultivated the entirety of the show on DVD and video. From season 1 to the Frog's Legacy and specials like that to the finale, Sleepless in Peckham, I just had this almost endless reservoir of viewing pleasure which made it nigh impossible in my younger days to not have something to watch on the family TV. We were such fans of the show at this point in my life that we would take the whole collection with us on DVD in the little slipcases, on holiday with us rather than go outside and play in the pool and other children in the Costa del Crime sunshine. Staying in and watching Dell Goes try to become a millionaire just seemed to make more sense to me, really, in my free time. So, what is Only Fools and Horses? Well, if you've downloaded this podcast, then I'm assuming you already know the basics, but for any particularly green listeners out there, Only Fools and Horses was a primetime BBC Two situation comedy / sitcom, which followed the lives of two scrappy Londoners, Derek Delboy Trotter and his dopey younger brother Rodney, as they tried to scrape by an existence and wheel and deal their way to a better lifestyle. Spoiler alert, and needless to say, it happened to go down pretty well with the public. In 2004, with a whopping 22.2% majority, it was voted as Britain's, as Delbo would put it, most favouriteest sitcom of all time. And whilst it did start off with an already rather commanding 7.7 million viewers during its first season, the show, like its protagonist, would manage to work its way up to the big time. And when the third in the Christmas special trilogy, Time on Our Hands, debuted, it raked in a staggering 24.3 million viewers. And this isn't just counting the people watching it in pubs or on someone else's TV. Speaking of pubs, by the way, just to put the sheer popularity of the show into a bit of context, when the programme moved to a Sunday night 50-minute format for its 5th and 6th seasons, John Sullivan was apparently bombarded with a host of letters from real-life pub landlords, basically asking him not to make the show as funny as it was, or to make it shorter again, or move it to a different time slot, as it was costing them enough trade, as people would rather stay inside and watch the show rather than go to the pub. This is more likely than not where the tradition of Only Fools and Horses being constantly played in pubs whenever football's not on came from. And it's just a testament to the show's popularity to this day. Any country on earth where British people go on holiday, there will be a pub somewhere playing Only Fools. That's just a fact. The show also, during its run, boasted several awards, most notably but not limited to the BAFTA Award for Best Sitcom Series, 1986, 1988 and 97. 97 was actually a great year for the show. It's the year with the aforementioned Christmas special, Time on Our Hands, and it was very lucrative actually, bagging the Writers Guild of Great Britain Writing Award for John Sullivan and the Royal Television Society's Best Comedy Programme. But, why am I doing a podcast like this? Why am I talking about Only Fools and Horses? There are so many great podcasts out there that talk about TV shows, but, I actually generally was surprised that this hadn't been done. And, I know that there are good ideas and there are ideas for shows that just haven't been done. But this was a nice, to use the Venn diagram image again, a nice little crossover for me. It is awfully hard to live here in England without having some sort of contact with the show in one way or another. Again, in the way that it's ingrained in my life, it is ingrained in the entire sort of social fabric and zeitgeist of the country. Everybody in the country knows about Grandad and the Chandelier, everybody knows about Dell Boy falling through the bar, and no one doesn't know the scene where the two dipsticks run down the street dressed as Batman and Robin. But to put it simply, I feel like since the show came to its close in 2003, spin-offs and prequels aside, and, despite the accolades it's gotten, like any sort of significant pop culture giant, the love and affection it creates will create a reverse negative where people will not allow it to be seen in the way it once was. Now Only Fools is a bit of the subject of parody, really, and the butt of one too many jokes. Again, too many people only remember these pratfalls, these sort of famous one-liner moments, and no one really talks enough about the biting social commentary, the wry, sly humour, and those incredible, unforgettable tear-jerker moments that rounded out the show to be a real slice of life. So what is the format of this programme going to be? As I was mentioning other podcasts earlier, another podcast that I'm a big fan of is a show called Caught on the Wire, which is hosted by two friends of mine, Alex and Toby, which is a show where they too review a TV show, The Wire. And I thought I'd just give them a little shout out, as I must admit I did take some inspiration from the way they will talk about the show and the way they sort of frame their podcasts, and I've allowed that to influence the way that I'm going to do this. In terms of spoilers, sorry folks, this show's over 30 years old now. I'm really not going to be avoiding spoilers on any level. I do want to go into, I'm going to go into a lot of detail with the plot in this, because you can't really discuss the writing and the impact of the writing without going into these spoilers. Each episode will hopefully start off with a bit of backstory, the actors, the context, the writer, set design, costume, every single aspect of the show that brought it together to make it what it was. Then, as per the title of each episode will dictate, we'll get into each episode with one episode of the show for one episode of the podcast, where I'll go into the plot, characterization, setups, payoffs, and just the evolution of the characters and the writing as the show progresses. I do personally feel that this is one of those shows that is quite a rare oddity in that it does just seem to get better and better and better. Specials not included. Each episode will be about 45 minutes to an hour and a half long. These episodes, especially in the early seasons, are only like 20 to 25 minutes long, so you can't go into that much detail. If you ever want to get in contact with the show to tell us your experiences with the show, perhaps you've met a member of the cast, maybe you agree with my views, maybe you disagree. If you've got anything to say about the show, please contact us at onlyfoolspod@gmail.com. And if you want to get in contact with us on the Twitter, at onlyfoolspodcast, you can join us, and I'll just be posting things like pictures, scenes, polls, quotes, and it's just a nice little forum to, talk to you fans and talk about the show. And one last thing before we dive into a bit of the backstory about the show, I'd just like to give a quick thanks and a shout out to the sources that have allowed me to get the requisite detail to make this podcast not just me saying how much I like the show and ranting on about my favourite moments, but has given me that in-depth insight into everything, really. Firstly, I want to just quickly thank the Only Fools and Horses Miscellany by Phil Martin, which is full of loads of quirky little tidbits. There's Only Fools and Horses by Graham McCann. He's a guy who's made loads of books on British TV and autobiographies. And then there's the Only Fools and Horses, the official inside story by Steve Clarke, which is actually a book that I did buy in anticipation for the podcast off Amazon. And I knew my dad had a big book on Only Fools and Horses, so I was like, okay, I've got these 3 books now. Perhaps I can go find this book. Spent a couple of hours trawling in the loft, found the book, brought it down, and it turns out it's the exact same book by Steve Clarke, except with this one had a foreword by Anthony Hopkins, and the one that I had a foreword by the British TV personality and businessman Theo Pathetis. So after hours of trawling in the loft, we actually did find the book. A large substantial thing. We get it downstairs, and it turns out it's just the official inside story by Steve Clarke, again in a different font and a different format. And instead of a foreword by British TV personality Theo Pathetis, it had a foreword by actor Anthony Hopkins instead. Speaking of my dad, I do actually also have to thank him, because without his own obsession with the show and the amount of money he's wasted on the DVD collection, this podcast would not be possible. The big difference with Only Fools and Horses and many other fantastic comedies is its singular vision. Like John Cleese with Fawlty Towers, Only Fools was written entirely by one man. This isn't just the standard BBC format of 2 series and a Christmas special. This show went in its entire run for over 20 years. And the man behind this was in fact John Sullivan. Now, literally 10 seconds ago, I was just thanking all the books that I've read in preparation for this podcast, and you would have thought that a man who was so integral to the biggest sitcom in British history would have some sort of biography, or even an autobiography, some memoirs perhaps. And no, he doesn't. There is literally zilch, squat, nada out there. And, whilst by no means I want to make this podcast a John Sullivan biography, I do want to make this a little tribute to his exceptional writing ability and storytelling. Sadly, we lost him back in April 2001, and British TV is all the worse off for having lost him. Born John Richard Sullivan to a poor working-class family, he grew up in Balham, South London, with his Irish father, John Sr., who was a plumber, and his mother, Hilda. Sullivan, who found education as little more than a distraction that would prevent him from playing football or getting a paid job to help feed the family, ended up attending Telford Scott's Secondary Modern in London, and he would eventually bump into the man that forever changed the way he saw writing and English literature and storytelling forever, and that was a young teacher named Jim Trowers. He was a Geordie with an eye patch and uncommonly long hair, and would turn what Sullivan called the robotic read, absorb, regurgitate, read, absorb, regurgitate method of teaching back in those days, and turn the stories, most notably stories from Dickens, who also wrote extensively about the lives of working class folk in an area Sullivan knew well, and turned it into something that would make just more sense to him, bringing the characters to life with voices, and would both encourage and inspire Sullivan's own passion for writing. He failed his 11 plus exams and left school at 15 with no qualifications to speak of whatsoever. He actually did still attend several evening classes in German and English, and had read several teach-yourself books after leaving school. I think the American equivalent would be the sort of Guide for Dummies range of books. He had several jobs for several years. He was a message boy, he was a car cleaner, which earned him about £3.50 a week. He then went up to a car trader, which earned him over £20 a week, which, considering the first typewriter he bought to write Only Fools and Horses on cost him £2, shows just how much money he was earning back then. He actually came up with the idea for writing a script with an old school chum of his named Paul Saunders, who, whilst they were both working in a brewery together, and the work was just so dull and so boring that they basically just said, we're funny enough, we can write, and we could rake in the average of £1,000 a script that the BBC were issuing at the time. He and Saunders were inspired by the gritty realism of shows like Till Death Do Us Part, and the tight balance of comedy and pathos of shows like Steptoe and Son, of whom the latter's elder and younger relationship would be almost note for note be repurposed for Dell and Rodney, especially in this opening episode. However, their first script, Gentleman, about a down-on-his-luck toilet attendant, kind of failed to catch fire at the BBC. They didn't like it, but Sullivan, he kept at it. Saunders, after the first failure, really didn't want to get back into writing, but Sullivan did enjoy the process so much that he kept sending in more and more scripts and changing his name several times, but all to no avail. And after several months of driving past the BBC, knowing he would eventually become a writer there, he decided to learn from within, and in November 1974 bagged himself a job in the props department, where, using his insight into the business, would begin slipping jokes and scripts to a very famous actor at the time named Ronnie Barker on the set of another British sitcom named Porridge. He would then walk up to, I think it was at some sort of BBC party function, where he would walk up to the producer of shows like The Goon Show and Hancock's Half Hour, Dennis Main Wilson, and just go straight up to him and say, "Hello, my name is John Sullivan. I thought I'd introduce myself, as one day we'll be working together." And Wilson basically just thought he meant, oh, okay, so he's on about working in props together. But once he found out that Sullivan actually meant he was a writer and he had a scripts ready for him, he was so impressed that he basically just sent him immediately to work for the two Ronnies and start writing sketches for them. After working on shows like Morecambe and Wise, Porridge and I, Claudius, he eventually got a BBC writing contract on a show named Citizen Smith. This was the first show where Sullivan was the showrunner. It was the story of a Trotskyite anarchist, Wolfie, who was basically a few quid short and a few revolutionaries short of a revolution. And I can't lie, I've never watched too much of Citizen Smith. I've seen a few episodes here and there. In fact, one of the episodes itself is named Only Fools and Horses. But after 4 seasons, Sullivan kind of felt like he had taken the character as far as he could go, and it was cancelled, and he needed to take a stab at something new. Sullivan's next writing project would be a show titled Over the Moon, which would follow the adventures of a hapless local football manager. And this was an idea Sullivan himself claimed he had high hopes for and was confident that it would work. And despite the BBC, initially rather liking the pilot and commissioning a whole series, around the time Sullivan was writing the 3rd or 4th episode, it was suddenly cancelled due to the BBC spies coming across information that there was a rival sports show about boxing on ITV that was going to be coming out called Seconds Out. So this was also being made at the same time, and they really didn't want an oversaturation of comedy sports shows. This would be the year that Sullivan would not so fondly remember as the year he had 2 shows cancelled. As he would say, "We'd just bought our first house in Sutton, Surrey, and frankly I was worried about being able to pay the mortgage. I was under contract for a year, but after that the future was looking very uncertain. Not only that, but no show on the box meant no repeat fees." But Sullivan himself wasn't the only person in dire need for Only Fools and Horses. This is the dawn of the 80s. This is Thatcherite England, not the brightest of futures. You can look back to things like This Is England or Billy Elliot. It's not the nicest place on earth. And around this time, there is a real dire need for a brand new sitcom to take the country by storm. Dad's Army and Porridge ended in 77, The Good Life and Rising Damp in 78, and the phenomenal Fawlty Towers was over in 79. And yes, there were these newer shows that were cropping up like To the Manor Born and Terry and June, but they were woefully middle class and worryingly safe. However, Sullivan did have this vague little nugget of an idea about the wheeler-dealer types that he grew up around in London, in markets and stuff like that, as he felt like they were always the most interesting characters to be around. As producer Ray Butt said, the idea didn't just come as some great blinding flash, it was just one of a number of ideas that John was bouncing around. Sullivan described the original treatment as being about modern working-class London. He said, "I was sick to death of all the kinds of comedies I saw on telly, which were almost always based in the 40s or earlier about toffs. Now we had a modern, vibrant, multiracial, new slang London where the working-class guys had suits and a bit of dosh in their pockets. It would be a little more aggressive and feature the pubs, clubs and tower blocks and even touch on the drug problem." However, the BBC execs weren't too impressed with this idea. They actually did prefer his old one, which they put the quash on. However, after sharing a few points with producer Ray Butt, who, like Sullivan, was a working-class London lad, although I think he was from East London as opposed to South London, like Sullivan. Butt's own father was one of these characters that had set up his own stall on Roman Road, selling anything and everything, including ice cream and jellied eels, which is something Del Boy alludes to in the Jolly Boys outing. Butt says, "The papers at the time were full of stories about the black market economy. Market traders were all working for the Reddies. They had the cash, and there was no way they were going to declare it all to the Inland Rev. You had to declare something, but the majority went in the bin, and the taxman never saw it." Butt was a bit of a bruiser for Sullivan. They both shared this working class background. even for Sullivan's other writing projects, Over the Moon, but was brought in to kick some backsides, as it were, and he really did have faith in Sullivan's writing ability. Their shared working class background did allow Butt to see past what the BBC establishment couldn't, and without going into too much detail, Only Fools and Horses had gotten off the ground. And I'll obviously get onto more of the recording process of this first series in future episodes. So let's quickly just discuss the title. Like I say, the title Only Fools and Horses is a Cockney phrase just to say Only Fools and Horses work, which, it perfectly does capture the trotter's desire to escape the realm of genuine graft, despite the somewhat ironic slant of Del Boy spending over 25 hours a day to not work at all. And just in my personal opinion, is far better than the original working title of Reddies, which the BBC apparently wanted to originally go with. But I'm very glad that Sullivan pushed for Only Fools and Horses. It's a very weird title, and I personally think it's just good because you do kind of have to stop and go, oh, okay, what is that? This sounds interesting. So, without any further ado, let us dive right into Only Fools and Horses, Season 1, Episode 1, the pilot, titled Big Brother. It was recorded on the 7th of June 1981, released on the 8th of September 1981 on BBC One, like I said, to an audience of around 7 million viewers, although you do kind of have to take into account that there was only 4 channels available at this time. There's no Amazon Prime, there is no Netflix, there is no Sky Movies, so you do have to kind of take into account that for a lot of people this would just be what was on then, and you didn't really have much of a choice over whether or not you could or not watch it. And as far as I'm aware, there wasn't much competition on that day specifically when it first debuted, so who knows, perhaps if they'd been showing a rerun of Ben-Hur on BBC Two, perhaps the show wouldn't have captured the same amount of audience members. It was directed by Martin Shardlow, who worked on shows like Last of the Summer Wine and the first series of The Blackadder, which is another show that I would like to return to. But Martin Shardlow actually did the entirety of Series 1. I never actually thought, coming back to this podcast, that I would talk much about the direction, but it's actually a lot better than you might give it credit for at first glance. It's very quick fire, you've got this multi-camera setup which gives this real speed and variety, and it's cutting between close-ups and wide shots and this huge variety of reactions that puts us squarely inside the family dynamic. We are moving with the characters, we are seeing what they're seeing, and we are thrown into the middle of these arguments, and it just feels very real. But anyway, I'm getting far too ahead of myself. Before we actually dive into the show, we actually do have the rather iconic opening credits. The sequence itself was conceived by graphic designer and future BBC presenter Peter Clayton, and he described it as a metaphor for the vagaries of the trotter's lifestyle. Basically, it's just a bunch of snapshots of London, of everyday life, along with images of the main cast's sequence like Polaroids, and then it's peeled off like stickers. The tower that appears in the background as the stand-in for Nelson Mandela House, the tower block where the trotters live, is actually Harlech Tower, Park Road, East Acton. As far as opening credit sequences go, it does remind me of the fantastic opening credit sequence for the Wes Anderson film, The Royal Tenenbaums. That too also does tell us everything we need to know about the characters in the shortest amount of time possible. We see Del Boy in a suit with a cheeky grin, flashing his cash. We see a rather despondent and confused Rodney in his rough leather jacket, turning out empty pockets. And we see a grimy grandad sat in his horrible chair, munching away on a greasy burger, perhaps hinting at either his inability to cook or a little hint as to what's going to happen in the first episode. Del Boy and Rodney's photos were updated 3 times over the course of the show to, show their aging and changing fashion trends, whereas Albert and Grandad only had 1 each. Now, the actual theme of the show was, for me, as far as I was aware, for years, I thought it was Nicholas Lyndhurst singing it. I'm not sure about you. I genuinely believe that Rodney sung the opening theme for the show as well as the closing. It does sound like him. If you close your eyes and you're not aware of what I'm about to say next, it's very conceivable. However, not only did John Sullivan, the writer, sing both of the theme tunes for the show, he actually wrote them as well. Though the BBC, for the first run of the first season, as well as the original Christmas special, used the Ronnie Hazelhurst instrumental theme, which you can hear at the start of the show. Hazelhurst himself wrote things for things like Last of the Summer Wine, Yes Minister, and Are You Being Served? And as the first series was re-edited for DVD and to be endlessly rerun all over the world on TV channels, the famous theme that we're all aware of was edited in its place. However, in this episode Big Brother, there is a short sequence around halfway through where Del Boy's selling the suitcases, where the original Hazelhurst music is left intact. The lyrics for the opening theme for the show not only establishes the theme, but also is just chock-a-block with both slang and references to British culture. The opening lyric, "To stick a pony in me pocket," a pony being a London slang for £25 sterling. You've got "Fetch the suitcase from the van," and "Where it all comes from is a mystery," all referencing the Trotters' shady cash-only business, and ends with the title lyric, "Why do only fools and horses work?" I defy anyone out there who isn't always singing along to it, and I just love the way the la 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 fades perfectly into each episode. It's like you're being welcomed back into a dream every single time. It's such a warm opening theme, and it's always a joy to listen to. The Radio Times rather aptly described the show as just simply being two brothers living with their granddad in a South London flat, living on shady deals. And I'm not sure I could describe the show better than that, really. You know, all first episodes and pilots are mostly just about finding that perfect balance between establishing both the tone and the humour of the show, as well as doling out as much of the background information as possible without, bogging it down in wordy story. Now, in terms of the actual plot, it's actually rather telling of the rather loose nature of the still relatively young series, whereas in later seasons when we meet characters like Raquel and Cassandra that bring a bit of stability into the Trotters' lives and dynamic and allows them to have a much more sustained and focused arc, these early episodes are essentially all just insular little one-offs using the same beloved characters but having little to do with each other in terms of interconnectivity. As Graham McCann puts it in his book Only Fools and Horses, he says, "What proved most compelling about the first series was the quality of the characters and how they were portrayed. Although Sullivan's script seemed to lack a real pattern from week to week, with some of them, such as Cash and Curry, our next episode, being so heavy on plot that dialogue seemed too light, and others, such as The Russians Are Coming, the season finisher, similarly imbalanced in the opposite way, thus supplying the series with plenty of variety at the expense of coherence. The simple and constant charm and clarity of the three main characters kept those who watched on a weekly basis more than richly entertained." And I couldn't agree more, really. The first season, I don't think it's anyone's favourite, so it's a rather difficult position for me to start a podcast on. But for me, this opening episode, Big Brother, I'm not going to give it brownie points just for being the first episode and being a competent pilot. It actually is very, very damn funny. But let's dive right into it. We open in the classic flat with Grandad watching a rather Carl Pilkington-esque twin TV setup, watching the same movie on both screens, and he and Rodney argue over the pronunciation of the actor on screen. Is it Sidney Potter or Sidney Poitier? In comes Rodney's older brother Dell, who settles the dispute by revealing it to be Harry Belafonte and begins fawning over himself in the mirror. However, Dell's good mood is quickly spoiled as he realises Rodney is doing the accounts for their business, despite the fact that for all intents and purposes they are off the grid and really shouldn't be keeping any records like this. Rodney and Dell then argue over their business dealings, as well as establishing some of their relationships with the government and their tumultuous family history. Now, I love this opening scene already. It's rather mind-boggling as how much they fit into this opening 5 minutes. We see that they are always constantly at each other's throats with the Sidney Poitier thing. We see Del Boy's vain, doing his hair in the mirror. We also get hear one of his first pig French phrases, s'il vous plaît, which is actually correct French, rather ironically. We also get a hint at their sort of high alcohol, high fat diet when Del complains about a pain in his stomach. And this actually does predate his yuppie stomach pains, but who knows, perhaps this is just genius foreshadowing on the part of Sullivan. Also, speaking of mind-blowing foreshadowing, it's very cool how in this opening episode, Del Boy, he admonishes Rodders for keeping the receipts as their accountant. But ultimately, it is Rodney's bookkeeping that will make them millionaires in the future in the episode Time on Our Hands, as Rodney finds the receipt for the John Harrison timepiece. There is this feeling here that perhaps maybe if Dell hadn't have been so harsh on Rodney in this first episode, they could have found the timepiece. Admittedly, it would have been less valuable at this point. It wouldn't have been as old, but perhaps they could have been millionaires right from the get-go if Del Boy had just allowed Rodney to do the books. We established the two brothers as being unfair partners in the business. Again, Rodney is a little green. He does see himself as being more of a partner, and Del Boy will constantly kind of see Rodney as working for him. There is the classic phrase here. Rodney, I split everything down the middle with you, 60-40. And I was actually discussing with my dad the other night, is this actually Dell having a joke with Rodney, because we actually know Rodney's not this stupid, or is this purely a joke for the audience's expense that really wouldn't be done in later episodes? Who knows? Another long-running joke we have here is establishing Dell and Rodney's mum. Immediately, people watching this show are probably thinking, wow, these two don't look like brothers at all. And that's what the BBC executives at the time said, but this is something that John Sullivan would actually turn into a key plot point of the show. But the fact that here already, we're in episode 1, Del Boy's already talking about his mum turning in her grave, just shows the real significance of this woman in their lives. She may be dead, but she's still this ever-present spectre in their lives. Another thing we get out of the way immediately is a very frank description by Dell as to their business practices. Throughout the show, I always wanted to see more of them on the streets and in the marketplaces trading stuff. But since we don't really get any of that in this episode, it is nice to hear that they are tax dodgers. They don't pay VAT, they don't pay income tax, national insurance. But Dell justifies this in a rather odd way by saying that they also, in return, they don't take dole money, supplementary benefits, or social security. And it's nice to see that they aren't just these leeches on society. They are trying to be subsistent. They are trying to get by, living off the grid, as it were. As I think it would just be totally impossible to sympathise with characters that are just, dole fiends. At least they do have a bit of British pride, which is always admirable to see on screen. But not only do we learn about their business practices, we also learn in what they deal with, which, as we learn throughout the course of the show, is mostly going to be crap. This episode, I believe it's one-legged turkeys that they're dealing with. Rodney's desire for a career is also brought up, which is opposed to Del Boy's love of the wheeler-dealer lifestyle. Come on, Rodney, you are self-unemployed. And Rodney's desire to break away from Dell and get a career of his own is one of the few things that is actually established in this episode and will go on throughout the entire show. Again, playing off that whole steptoe and son dynamic. One thing I did notice that was, it is immediately significant that there is only a grandfather in their lives, and his presence alone, before they even have to mention what happens to the unseen parents, already does lend a bit of a tragic air to their lives, really, without having to sort of bog you down in the nitty-grittiness of it. Then we head down to the local pub with Dell and Rodney, the Nag's Head, which was, the exterior was actually filmed at the Alma pub in Islington, where they continue to chat about their own lives and aspirations, as well as the grim sort of lack of options that a young man like Rodney has. They then actually go on to discuss Rodney's attempt at further education, which is great. Rodney tries to, he tried to better himself, but unfortunately, at the end of his first term, Rodney was caught smoking the exotic tobacco in his dorm room while shacked up with a Chinese foreign exchange student, which ended up in both of them being expelled. Then in comes Del Boy's old school friend Trigger, who has a stolen consignment of plastic, or as Dell puts it, English vinyl briefcases, and they basically just bargain with each other as to how much Dell is going to buy these hot goods for. Dell offers, I think it was £8 each, and he comes to the total of £175. But thanks to Rodney's inability to shut up and having to be right in terms of academic conversation, means they end up having to pay the honest price of £200. Again, keeping with this episode's theme of just getting across as much information as possible in the shortest amount of time, we do, as they enter the pub, get a glimpse of Del Boy's notorious popularity, especially with the ladies. People are immediately saying hello, waving. Characters like Dell, as we'll get onto in future episodes, as David Jason noted, they were immensely popular, and despite the fact of whether they had money or not, they would act like it. They would buy drinks for people and always be these pillars of just trust within the community. We now learn that they are both fatherless and motherless. Their dad isn't dead though, and only walked out on them. And this does lay the seeds for a future episode where he will come back. Now, whilst we don't see the three-wheeled van, we do learn that Rodney hates it and he keeps going on about it. Also, again, we're establishing Dell's love of the wheeler-dealer lifestyle. He really does enjoy ducking and diving, living on the edge, and it does give him this adrenaline rush, really, that I don't think a normal career could give him. But, like I've said, it does infuse that rather tragic irony of he can't just wing being a wheeler-dealer. He does have to work very hard at it, despite the fact that he actually doesn't want to work. Now, earlier I did also mention that John Sullivan did actually want to touch on the drug problem. And, whilst Rodney's not some crack addict or anything, huffing WMD, he is caught with marijuana. And in the episode, as one door closes, it is revealed that Dell did actually have high hopes for Rodney's defence, only to learn that Rodney actually pleaded guilty by post 3 days just before the trial. We also get introduced to the only character that will be, shown to us throughout the entirety of the rest of the show, which is Trigger, played by Roger Lloyd Pact. And Trigger is actually not really the Trigger we come to know here. He's actually a bit of a wheeler dealer like Dell here, as opposed to his classic road sweeper moniker. But many things are still the same. He's still pretty dim, and we do get the first rendition of him calling Rodney Dave. However, this doesn't get much of a laugh, oddly enough. But this is mostly just because this is the planting of a seed for a long-running gag that, as we all know, will get much funnier as the show progresses. Like, a lot of jokes like this, you'd kind of think, oh, come on, they can't still be doing this. This running gag isn't funny. But for some reason, with this one in particular, just because of how dim and absurd it is, always made me laugh. It is rather weird for me, though, that Rodney only now just inquires as to the origin of Trigger's name. Hasn't Trigger been friends with Dell since school? I don't know. In the business dealing with Dell and Trigger, it also shows that Dell is willing to, ruthlessly undercut even his closest friends out of £25, but also his lack of respect for Rodney in the partnership and not allowing him to be a part of the debate process. However, on the flip side, in the fact that Rodney ends up making them pay the honest £200 as opposed to £175, highlight Rodney's own green inexperience at negotiating and just ruthless businessmanship. However, Rodney's assumption that he is much more of an academic businessman would be purely because he has 2 GCEs, now GCSEs, in maths and art. After this, we cut back to the flat and we find Dell desperately trying to flog the collection of suitcases on the phone to a seemingly endless stream of potential buyers. Rodney then bursts in, bearing food that Grandad has been moaning about for a while. However, rather than fulfilling the correct order of an Emperor burger, he's in fact bought a cheeseburger, claiming that it was all he could afford. The two continue to eavesdrop on Dell's conversation as they find out that his most recent contact, Dougie Sadler, has coincidentally had a consignment of 25 briefcases stolen from his store. However, it turns out the whole lot turned out to be faulty rejects anyway, and much to Dell's annoyance, Rodney advises just chucking the whole lot in the bleeding river. Rodney and Dell continue to argue over Rodney's position of financial advisor in the quote-unquote partnership, and Dell roundly demonstrates why Rodney is no such thing. Rodney then brings up his perceived poor upbringing and Dell's inability to stay out of his affairs. Rodney declares his independence from Dell and storms out. Okay, let's just get the funniest part of this scene out of the way. The whole Emperor Burger cheeseburger fiasco. Come on, Dell, you know it's against the law to force feed a senior citizen a cheeseburger. This kind of really highlights Grandad's role in the show. He's not really going to be the focus of any of these plots. Maybe one or two here and there. But it is mostly going to be Dell and Rodney's story, and Grandad's just there to be this figure of both annoyance, love, and a sheer source of comic relief. Even though it is a comedy, he is the comic relief character. When Rodney comes in, Grandad cites Dell as a real trier. This is the 20th phone call Dell has made. He's got so many contacts. And as Grandad puts it, your dad always said one day Del Boy would reach the top. But then again, he also said one day Millwall would win the cup. So perhaps that is a little moniker for the show, really. No matter how much Del Boy tries, he is at a very clear disadvantage. Millwall's never going to beat Manchester, are they? We do get a nice little background information here about the characters. We learn that Del Boy is the one who kept the family together since Dell's and Ronnie's dad walked out. And basically Grandad was just too unqualified to really take care of them. Rodney, however, he claims they had really terrible food and that his care of the child was insufficient, despite Dell's best efforts. And this is a first again of another running joke, which is Dell's ability to essentially guilt Rodney into doing anything he wants, doing that classic turning away from Rodney to make him feel bad. This is a knife in my heart, a stab in the back, the cold shoulder. He really has this hold over Rodney. He has raised him from a child, and we know that Del Boy as a parent does know Rodney inside out, despite how much Rodney might protest that. Again, keeping in with Steptoe and Son, there is this tension between the two. One of them wants to break away, one of them wants independence, whereas secretly the elder is just possibly a little bit lonely and doesn't want the other to go away at all. And as Rodney, storms out declaring that he doesn't need Dell for anything, this rather dramatic and possibly very dark moment is hilariously undercut when Rodney has to come back to essentially beg for money for the pub. And, whilst it does negate the drama from the act, it's so damn funny. Though it is a little upsetting to see that Dell won't even look at him. Next morning, and Dell is still concerned as to how he's going to sell all of these cases, only to find out from Grandad that Rodney has set off for Hong Kong. He's packed his bags and he's off to meet up with the Chinese student who he got kicked out of the arts college. Grandad implores Dell to go searching for him, but Dell insists that it's only one of Rodney's little games. Now, as Grandad puts it, Rodney proving himself is actually just another plot that will end up being recycled for Rodney Come Home. I'm not saying Rodney Come Home is a bad episode or anything, but we have seen this kind of thing before, and we do know, especially in that episode, that everything does have to kind of come back and resolve itself by the end of the episode. So I feel that Rodney Come Home is an episode that is kind of undercut by this one. This plot point mirrors almost note for note the pilot of Steptone's Son, a program, as we've said, greatly influenced Sullivan. However, it isn't as dark as that pilot, and this is probably for the best. It eschews a scene where Harold, the Rodney character, actually breaks down in tears as to how tightly his life is entwined with his father, the Dell character. And I think the decision to make this show about two brothers as opposed to a father and son gives the whole affair a bit more of a bouncy vibe, really. There is a bit less consequence to their actions, and it does give it a more of a us versus the world attitude, and does in turn both give it a greater potential for more petty squabbling as it does for more charming brotherly love. Next is a short montage sequence when Dell goes around London trying to sell the suitcases. This was also in the marketplace in Alma Islington, around the area where the Nag's Head exterior was shot. And this is also the scene that does reuse that original Ronnie Hazelhurst theme tune for the show. So if you do have it on DVD, this is the only way, besides YouTube, that you'll be able to listen to this song. Back in the flat, Grandad struggles with another dodgy item that Dell has probably brought back to him, this time an electronic chess game. And he admonishes it for not being able to play electronic drafts. And Dell Boy sits still irked about being unable to sell the briefcases after 6 days. So, Rodney's been gone for quite a while now. Then they hear the door slam. Dell and Grandad are greatly surprised when in comes a very bedraggled and underfed Rodney. As Grandad goes to put the kettle on, Dell inquires as to Rodney's adventures, which apparently saw him making it as far as Saint-Tropez, and was offered to dine upon the yacht of an exotic millionaire tax exile with a gorgeous girl. But unfortunately, Rodney's homesickness and fondness for urban England brought him home. However, Dell's interest in the story turns out to be fake, as he knew that all along Rodney had left his passport and couldn't have left the country either way. But after Rodney being rather annoyed that Dell has put him in his place again as the father figure, making him feel rather foolish, Dell ultimately confesses that he did end up taking Rodney's advice about the suitcases and chucking them in the river. And we end on a rather lovely high note with the two brothers making amends, and they darkly laugh about all the money they have lost. Again, thus keeping the status quo, and presumably both heading off down the pub to celebrate. In a rather opposite manner to the previous scene where Rodney, the rather tragic moment, is undercut by a great gag, the lovely reunion hug, which is a great moment of pathos for us as audience members, is also hilariously undercut with the cup of tea going straight into Dell Boy's mouth. The fact that Dell had Rodney's passport the entire time does establish that Dell is, despite the fact being a bit of a plonker and a dipstick himself, is always going to be typically right. He does have the contacts, he does have the life experience and the know-how just to get through life and always be able to best Rodney. And in typical Season 1 fashion, it ends, aka very abruptly. Then we have the very famous closing theme. There was no original alternative for the closing theme. The BBC were very happy with Sullivan's closing theme. And like the opening, it follows suit and tries to give you a slice of life of the characters, as it describes the dubious goods that the Trotters will specialise in, from miles and miles of carpet tiles to Trevor Francis tracksuits, Trevor Francis being an English football player during the 70s and 80s. These are from a mush in Shepherd's Bush, mush being slang for a man whose name is unknown, and Shepherd's Bush being a West London district. We have the line that no income tax, no VAT, which was summarised earlier, Dell Boy's sort of volatile outlook on the government, and we close with the very, very catchy refrain of God Bless Hooky Street, hooky being a typical British slang for something stolen or that has been acquired illegally. And there we have it, really. That's episode 1. In just over 20 minutes we have established the relationship and backstory between Rodney and Dell, their strained, opposed business relations. You know, we've got Rodney's honest nature versus Dell's conmanship. Rodney's view of himself as a financial advisor versus Dell's view of him as an employee van driver / lookout. We have the clash of opinions over the wheeler-dealer lifestyle as opposed to Rodney wanting to go straight. We have Dell's contentment with their lives and Rodney's sort of perhaps blind youthful ambition. We see that these two do have a meagre lifestyle. They do scrape by. We don't know how in between episodes they do make ends meet. I mean, in the next episode, Cash and Kerry, they lose everything, and we never see how they make it back. But we know that, as we've established in this, that Dell does have the ability, and like in all of these opening season episodes, we will establish that by the end of each episode, we will either be back to where they were or actually be at a loss from where they were at the start. But they will always have made amends with each other. So, my overall thoughts. This is a great opening pilot. It contains more than enough laughs to set the tone and tells us more than everything we need to know about the characters, whilst leaving plenty of room for expansion. We only meet one great side character. Actually, funny enough, Trigger is the only character who will appear both in the first episode and last episode who isn't Dell or Rodney. But across the board, the acting is stellar. All of the characters fly off the screen and are totally believable, while still obviously inhabiting a comedy world without getting too zany or crazy. And yes, it would have been nice to perhaps set up arcs, but they didn't know that this show was going to take off in the way it did, so it's clear to see why it has this sort of standalone setup format. This is a very fun episode. It's a great way to kick off the show, and it's impossible not to be rather taken by these characters as soon as we've met them, and I can't wait to see where they go next. So yeah, thank you. This has been the very first episode of Only Fools and Podcasts. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please get in contact us with the show at onlyfoolspod@gmail.com. Get in contact us with the Twitter at onlyfoolspodcast. I've been your host, Sam Wiles. And you know what, folks? This time next year, I'll have 1 million downloads. Thank you. See you next time.